You can elevate any garment by just adding some details. You can add a flounce or a ruffle to any dress or any shirt and it'll change the complete look. So I'm going to show you exactly how to draft a sewing pattern to add a flounce to any garment. Okay, before we get started on the process of drafting your flounce sewing pattern, I want to go over a couple of things. So this is my sewing pattern on the flounce you saw on the mannequin. And these are the books that I refer back to when I'm trying to learn something and get a little bit creative. This book I own. It's my Professional Sewing Techniques for Designers. It's one of the books that I mentioned in my top 10 sewing books video. I'll put a link to that in my description if you want to watch that. This is The Art of Manipulating Fabric. I do have this on loan from my local, actually from the Interlibrary, which is a service through my local library. If I learn about a book that's interesting to me that I think will be useful, I borrow it first to give it a test run. If it's something that I feel that I'm going to get a lot of use out of it, then I'll go ahead and purchase it after I've reviewed it. Not all books are in the library, but at least I look and see before making that purchase. I'll have both of these books listed in the description with links to Amazon if you want to check those out. All right, the other thing is my paper. I don't use the traditional sewing pattern paper. I purchased a box of these rolls years ago and I'm still using it up. I'll try to find it on Amazon. I don't know, it's been a very long time, but this is actually the tissue paper that they use at the doctor's office on the examining tables, and I find it very, very helpful for sewing patterns. The fabric that I'm going to try to use is the same thing that I used in the first pattern, which initially was a dress. I like to ask my friends and family to think about me when they're cleaning out their closets. If there are pieces that they're going to get rid of, whether they're stained or there's a hole in them or they just don't want them anymore, I always ask them to think about me and I use them frequently. So this is a perfect example. Not only did I cut out the ruffle that you see on that mannequin out of this piece, which was, I believe, the front, I also used part of the dress to test out this piping around a patch pocket. So I wanted to test the technique and I thought this would be perfect. So you can use this over and over and over again, try to get as much use out of it before you dispose of it. So I'm going to try my best to cut out the bigger flounce pattern that I'm going to be creating today, because I want to show you how the depth of the flounce piece will change how it drapes. That's my goal with this video, in addition to teaching you how to draft your own sewing pattern. First thing I want to do, go ahead and open up a little piece of this paper. And a little bit about how I drafted this pattern here. So I basically figured out what I wanted my radius to be. And to be completely honest with you, I really guessed on this here because I wanted to get creative, and the dress had a couple of stains on it. I wasn't too sure if I was even going to be able to use the flounce. So one of the great things about that process is it doesn't matter if it doesn't work out. That's really when you discover things. You're able to play around with it and just let your creative juices flow. I actually used a plate, small plate. I drew my inner circle, and that is now the seam line where I'm going to attach the flounce. Now, if you want to get a little bit technical, the distance between the very center of that circle and the actual edge of the circle, that's your radius from the inner circle to the edge of that circle. That's going to determine how small the circle or how big the circle is going to be. Now, the smaller the circle, the more flare or spiral your flounce is going to have. The larger your radius or inner circle, the less flare your flounce will have. So that's what I'm going to show you by creating a bigger one than the one you saw on the mannequin. Other thing that's going to determine how much movement or flaring or draping your flounce is going to have is by determining the depth of your flounce. You want to consider the type of fabric that you're using. Is it heavy? Is it very lightweight? So the distance between the sewing line and the hem, that's your depth. The longer it is, the more it will flare. I know that sounds like a lot. I'm going to add all of that technical information on a blog post, and that's going to be on my website, and I'll put a link in the description so you can read it at your leisure. Okay, so here's my inner circle, which is my seam line. You're going to draw that. Then you're going to determine your depth, which is the distance from the seam line to the hem of your flounce. You're going to determine your grain line. So you're basically going to draw your line. I'm just going to use this as an example. I know I already cut it here, but I just want to show you what I'm talking about. This now becomes both the grain line and it also becomes the cutting line for your flounce. Now, you do have several options. There are so many different variations that you can get by changing the opening or the cut line of your flounce. In this particular case, I have two tapered ends, and very simply, all I did before I cut out the flounce, I drew by hand kind of the shape that I wanted to go for. If you can see here, this edge kind of came out just a little bit. This is not a perfect circle, but I knew kind of the shape that I wanted to get, so I basically just drew the curve by hand. Then I did the same here. I drew a line, and then I started playing with it. Once I had the curves kind of the way that I wanted them, then I went ahead and cut it out. Let's put this aside and let's go ahead and draft the pattern for the bigger flounce so that I can show you how the draping is different depending on the depth of your flounce. Now there are several ways that you can draw your inner circle. You can use a round object like I did here with the plate. I've seen a few videos on YouTube where you create your own compass using a pencil with a string, and you can either use a thumbtack or anything like that. You basically hold the string in the middle, measure your string to how much your radius is going to be, and then by holding the thumbtack in place, you're drawing your circle all the way around. I'm going to try and find one of those YouTube videos, and I'll try to link it in the description. If not, a quick search, you'll be able to find it easily. The other way to do it is use a quilting ruler that has, the ability to draw circles, and there's quite a few out there. I'll try to link something in the description for that as well. I'm just going to bring all of my dishes to my sewing room. All right, so here's the radius that we're going to be working with for this particular pattern. I'm just going to start off by using the size of this plate as my radius and just kind of work from there. Now obviously with this size radius, I will only have a certain amount of seam line for this ruffle. You can put two ruffles together if the area that you're adding the ruffle to is much larger. You can have 2, 3, 4 flounces, and then you can just seam them together and make a one long ruffle that's gonna cover the entire area. Let's say that you have a skirt, and the skirt is like a full maxi skirt, and you want to add a couple of flounces to the bottom or wherever. You can just take several flounces, stitch them together, and then just make one big strip of flounce. All right, so now that I have my inner circle, now my flounce that I have on the mannequin, the depth of that flounce is 4 inches. Let's make this one 6 inches. So basically what I'm doing is I am marking only because I don't have a plate big enough. And to be honest, I really don't feel like putting together a string compass right now. So here's the edge. I think the trick to this is try to put as many markings as possible so that you can connect the dots. And you can freehand it depending on how good you are at freehanding. Or you can use one of your curved rulers and just connect your little markings. I probably should have used a darker marker so you can see this. I'll go ahead and get one and use it for when I connect those dots. Alright, so I'm gonna go ahead and connect all of my markings to create my circle. Alright, so once we finish our circle, we have 6 inches of depth. Now we're going to go ahead and say this particular flounce, I'm going to make this a straight end on both sides. And that's going to be my grain line, and that's also going to be my cutting line. Now, once you have your flounce drawn, make sure you add your seam allowance. Now, for purposes of just making this sample here, I'm not going to add seam allowance, but you would basically go in and add your seam allowance here inside of your circle. Now, my preference for curved seams is 3/8 of an inch. So you would do that all the way around, and then you would connect those dots and you would cut here. This is your cutting line, this is your seam line. So I like to use 3/8 of an inch for seam allowance on curved seam lines, and depending on what type of hem you choose for your flounce, that will determine your hem allowance basically. All right, so I'm just gonna go ahead and add seam allowance to the seam line, but I'm not gonna add seam allowance to the hem line, just for the purposes of this particular pattern piece. Alright, so now that we have our cut line, which is our grain line, we have our radius, we have our seam allowance that we've added, we have a 6-inch depth on our flounce, and typically you would add seam allowance for your hem, but in this case, just for purposes of this video, I'm not going to do that. Now, I like to have designated rotary cutters. These are for my fabrics, and these are for my patterns. So let's go ahead and cut this out and get it draped on the dress form. Alright, so now we're ready to cut this out of our fabric. First, let's make sure that this piece is going to be enough. If not, I believe I have another dress in my little stash of donated pieces that I can use. And I think the fabric is similar. Oh, I don't have enough. Alright, let's pull out the other dress and let's see if that works. Alright, since I don't have enough fabric on that dress, on that blue dress, let's go ahead and, this fabric is probably a little bit lighter, but it'll do the trick. Alright, so for purposes of trying out this flounce, it doesn't matter if I have a seam somewhere. Actually, let's see if I can make this work. I'm trying to get this where the camera captures the entire piece. Alright, and I'm gonna try to align this in a way for me to have the rest of the dress to use on other things, whether I'm testing a pattern or I can use it for actual pieces of a new garment. So let's go ahead and cut this out. Alright, now we have our flounce cut out, and let's go ahead and take a look. Let's go ahead and drape our new flounce right next to the other flounce. Alright, here are the final results. This was the smaller flounce. It has a 4-inch depth. The radius is smaller. Larger radius, 6-inch depth on the flounce. As you can see, they drape quite differently. So you can play around with it, get creative, add some detail to your garments. If you want to see different ways on how you can hem your flounce, you can use a rolled hem, and there are 2 ways you can do that. If you don't have a rolled hem foot on your machine, I can show you how to do that just by folding it, stitching it, folding it again. Let me know if you want to see a video like that. You could also add a decorative serged seam to the edge. That could give it a nice pop of color or interest. You can use the raw edge of the fabric if it doesn't fray, or if you want to let it fray a little bit and just have that look, you can do that as well. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Let me know what else you want to see. I'll see you guys in the next video.